Black homeless veteran falsely accused when Dr. Marcus Johnson handed over his Medal of Honor. He thought he was letting go of the past without knowing it would lead to the most humiliating moment of his life, until his fingers brushed the velvet box hidden in his jacket pocket. What happened next would not only shatter his pride, but deliver the most unforgettable shock anyone in the room had ever witnessed. Drop a comment if you've ever been judged by your appearance. Enjoy the story. Have you ever been publicly humiliated for something you couldn't control? What you're about to witness will make your blood boil. It was 10 a.m. on a cold December morning at Westfield Mall. Marcus sat quietly on a bench near the food court, his weathered military jacket providing little warmth against the winter chill. The homeless shelter had kicked everyone out at dawn, standard procedure. He wasn't bothering anyone, wasn't asking for money. Just a tired veteran trying to stay warm until the shelter reopened. That's when Cassidy Reynolds spotted him. At 21, Cassidy had climbed the ranks at Westfield Mall faster than anyone expected. Her perfectly pressed orange blazer and designer glasses gave her an air of authority she wore like armor. She surveyed the mall like a general commanding troops, always looking for problems to solve. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm going to need you to move along. This is private property." Marcus looked up calmly, his tired eyes meeting hers. "I'm not causing any trouble, miss. Just staying warm until the shelter opens." "What would you do if someone dismissed your greatest achievements as lies?" "You're loitering," Cassidy snapped, her voice carrying across the food court. Shoppers began to turn and stare. Christmas music played overhead, a cruel contrast to the tension building. "And you're making our customers uncomfortable." Marcus stood slowly, his knees protesting from too many nights on concrete. "I understand your concern, but I have every right to be here. I'm not panhandling or disturbing anyone." Cassidy's eyes narrowed with disgust. She'd dealt with his type before, homeless people who thought they knew their rights. "Security," she called out. Two guards approached, hands resting on their equipment belts. The growing crowd of shoppers whispered among themselves, phones appearing as the drama unfolded. "Ma'am, I'm a veteran," Marcus said, pulling out his weathered military ID with dignity intact. "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a Navy SEAL medic. I'm not looking for trouble." Here's where it gets infuriating. Cassidy barely glanced at the ID before letting out a cruel laugh. "Anyone can fake those nowadays," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Half the homeless people in this city claim to be veterans. It's the oldest sob story in the book." The crowd gasped. Several people started recording. Marcus's hand instinctively moved to a small velvet box in his jacket pocket, a habit he developed since losing everything. His jaw tightened, but he remained silent. "Officers," Cassidy continued with a smirk that would haunt her forever, "I want this man arrested for trespassing and loitering." They had no idea who they were really dealing with. Drop a comment if you've ever been judged by your appearance, because what happens next will shock you. In the mall security office, Marcus sat quietly in a metal chair while Cassidy paced like a predator circling its prey. The police were on their way, and she was already savoring her victory. "You know what your problem is?" she said, pausing to look down at him with pure contempt. "You think the world owes you something because you claim to be a veteran. Well, newsflash, I've heard it all before." Marcus didn't respond. Years of military discipline had taught him when to stay silent. Officer Patricia Henley arrived first, a 20-year veteran of the force who'd seen enough to recognize authenticity. She took one look at Marcus's posture, his bearing, the way he stood when she entered, and her instincts kicked in. "What seems to be the problem here?" she asked professionally. "This man was loitering and refusing to leave," Cassidy said quickly, adjusting her glasses nervously. "When I asked him nicely to move along, he became belligerent and started claiming to be some kind of war hero." Officer Henley studied Marcus carefully. Something about him didn't match Cassidy's description. "Sir, do you have identification?" Marcus handed over his military ID, driver's license, and VA medical card without a word. Henley examined them thoroughly, cross-referencing the information. Her expression shifted. "Ma'am," she said to Cassidy, This gentleman has legitimate identification. Unless he was actually disturbing the peace or committing a crime, he has every right to be in a public space. But he's homeless. Cassidy protested, her voice rising an octave. He's driving away customers. This is a business, not a charity. Being homeless isn't illegal. Officer Henley replied firmly. And I don't see evidence he was disturbing anyone. Here's where Cassidy made her fatal mistake. Frustrated and embarrassed by the pushback, she pulled out her phone and hit record. Her finger trembled slightly as she aimed the camera at Marcus. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she said into the lens. "The police won't even do their job anymore. We have a vagrant terrorizing innocent shoppers, and nobody cares because he waves around some fake military ID. Have you ever witnessed someone abuse their power like this?" Because Cassidy was about to learn that actions have consequences. Marcus closed his eyes, knowing that once something hit social media, there was no controlling the storm that would follow. What Cassidy didn't know, what none of them knew, was the extraordinary act of kindness Marcus had performed just hours earlier. At 6:47 that morning, Marcus had been sitting on a bench outside the mall, nursing a cup of gas station coffee and counting quarters for breakfast. The irony wasn't lost on him that 18 months ago, he'd been saving lives in a state-of-the-art trauma unit. A young mother with 2 children had hurried past, juggling shopping bags and a crying toddler, where a purse slipped and coins scattered across the concrete. Marcus was on his feet instantly. Military training never leaves you. "Ma'am, you dropped these," he'd said gently, returning her recovered change. Deborah Martinez looked up with exhausted, desperate eyes. "Thank you. I'm sorry, it's just... my husband's in the hospital, and I'm trying to buy Christmas presents with what little we have left." Marcus studied her face, the hollow cheeks, trembling hands, the way she clutched those coins like they were precious gems. He'd seen that look before, in his own mirror every morning. Without hesitation, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside lay his Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, worth approximately $15,000. "This should help," he said, pressing the box into her stunned hands. "Take it to Goldman's Pawn on 5th Street. Tell them Dr. Johnson sent you." "I can't take this," Deborah whispered, recognizing the medal's significance. "You earned this. And now I'm earning something better," Marcus replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Back in the security office, Marcus's calm demeanor under pressure revealed his military background to those paying attention. Officer Henley noticed how he sat at attention, how his responses were measured and respectful despite the humiliation. But there were other clues hidden in plain sight. When Cassidy mentioned calling an ambulance just to be safe in a mocking tone, Marcus automatically rattled off proper emergency protocols. When she complained about a paper cut from earlier, he instinctively assessed the wound and suggested treatment, the kind of instant medical response that takes years to develop. "Interesting," Officer Henley murmured, watching him carefully. "You seem to know a lot about medical procedures." Marcus caught himself, realizing he'd revealed too much. "You pick things up," he said quietly. What Officer Henley didn't know was that Dr. Marcus Johnson had once been one of the most skilled trauma surgeons in the country. PTSD had ended his career after an episode in the operating room nearly cost a patient their life. He'd resigned rather than risk another person's safety. The weight of what he'd lost, his career, his home, his identity, pressed down on him as Cassidy continued her humiliating tirade. Within 20 minutes, Cassidy's video had exploded across social media platforms. "Homeless man terrorizes mall shoppers," read her caption. The hashtag veteran shaming began trending as thousands shared the footage of her confronting Marcus. But the response wasn't what she expected. Comments poured in, but they weren't supporting her. "This is disgusting. How dare you treat a veteran like this? That man has more dignity in his little finger than you have in your whole body. I hope you lose your job over this." Cassidy's face went pale as she scrolled through the backlash. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications, and none of them were positive. The mall's main number was ringing off the hook. Angry callers demanded justice for the veteran, threatened boycotts, and called for Cassidy's immediate termination. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she muttered, deleting and reposting the video with different captions, trying to control the narrative. But the internet had already made up its mind. Marcus sat quietly through it all, watching his deepest humiliation spread to millions of viewers. Officer Henley kept glancing between her phone and Marcus, clearly troubled by the growing storm. "Sir," she said gently, "I think we can resolve this without any charges. You're free to go." But Cassidy wasn't finished. Desperation made her double down on her accusations. "No," she shouted, her professional demeanor completely shattered. "He was terrorizing customers. Just because some people on the internet are bleeding hearts doesn't change what happened." She turned her camera back on, this time streaming live to her social media followers. "I don't care how many angry comments I get," she declared to her audience. "This man is a fraud, and I won't be intimidated into backing down." The live stream viewer count climbed rapidly. 50, 100, 500 people watching her dig her own grave deeper. That's when Marcus looked directly into the camera and said 5 words that would change everything. "Ma'am, I forgive you already." At 2:17 p.m., everything changed when a black town car pulled up to the mall's main entrance. The real story was about to begin. Out of the town car stepped a figure that commanded immediate attention. Elijah Winters, 25 years old, moved through the mall with the kind of purpose that made people stop and stare. His perfectly tailored azure suit, immaculate wavy brown hair, and piercing blue eyes announced his importance before anyone even knew his name. But it was the thin scar along his jawline that told a different story, one of survival, transformation, and death. Word of his arrival spread through the mall like wildfire. Shoppers whispered his name, employees straightened their uniforms, and managers appeared from back offices. When Elijah Winters showed up somewhere, lives changed. He walked directly toward the security office, flanked by 2 lawyers in expensive suits and trailed by reporters who'd been following the social media explosion. His expression was calm, but those who knew him recognized the storm brewing behind those compassionate eyes. Cassidy looked up from her phone, where she'd been frantically trying to control the social media disaster. The color drained from her face as she recognized the approaching figure. "Oh God," she whispered, her hands trembling as she adjusted her now wrinkled orange blazer. Security guards stepped aside without being asked. Mall management appeared, eager to assist, but clearly nervous about why the city's most influential young philanthropist was here. Elijah entered the security office and looked directly at Marcus, who sat with quiet dignity despite everything he'd endured. "I'm here for Dr. Johnson," Elijah said simply, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. The room fell silent. Even Marcus looked up in surprise. Cassidy's voice cracked as she asked, "I'm sorry, who are you?" "Elijah Winters," he replied, his gaze never leaving Marcus. "And you made a very serious mistake." The name hit Cassidy like a physical blow. Everyone in the city knew that name. "Dr. Johnson," Elijah said, extending his hand with genuine warmth. "It's been far too long." Marcus stood slowly, confusion evident across his weathered face. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" What happened next would leave everyone speechless. Elijah's smile carried both sadness and profound gratitude. 3 years ago, you saved my life. Emergency surgery after a catastrophic car accident. I was unconscious for most of it, but I never forgot your voice. You stayed with me through the night, even though your shift had ended hours earlier. The memory crashed back into Marcus like a wave. A young man, barely out of college, massive internal injuries from a head-on collision. The surgery had been touch and go for 14 grueling hours. Marcus had refused to leave the operating room, then stayed by the patient's bedside for 3 days until he stabilized. "Elijah," Marcus whispered, recognition dawning. "My God, look at you. You told me that night that every life has purpose." Elijah continued, his voice thick with emotion. "That surviving meant I had work to do. You were right. The Winters Foundation has built 12 hospitals, funded hundreds of scholarships, and helped thousands of people get back on their feet." Cassidy's legs nearly gave out. The Winters Foundation wasn't just any charity. It was responsible for the new Children's Hospital, the homeless shelter on Oak Street, and the Veterans Rehabilitation Center downtown. This young man controlled more resources than most corporations. "All because you saved my life," Elijah said to Marcus. "But what are you doing here?" Elijah asked gently, though his eyes already held the devastating truth. "What happened to you?" Marcus's shoulders sagged under the weight of his story. "PTSD. I had an episode in the operating room 6 months after I treated you. Nearly lost a patient because of my condition. I couldn't trust myself anymore, so I resigned. And the VA? Understaffed, overwhelmed. I'm on a waiting list for proper treatment." Marcus managed a bitter laugh. "Ironic, isn't it? I spent years saving other people, and I can't even save myself." Elijah turned to face Cassidy, his compassionate eyes now blazing with controlled fury that made the temperature in the room seem to drop 10 degrees. "Ms. Reynolds," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "I believe you owe Dr. Johnson an apology." I didn't know," Cassidy stammered, her designer glasses fogging with panicked breath. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to listen," Elijah replied, each word carefully measured. "You saw a homeless man and made assumptions. You humiliated a decorated veteran, a man who has saved more lives than you can possibly comprehend." The reporters outside were getting restless, and Elijah's lawyers whispered updates about the social media storm still raging. Hashtag veteran shaming had evolved into hashtag justice for Marcus, and the story was spreading beyond social media into mainstream news. But Elijah wasn't finished. "Dr. Johnson," he said, turning back to Marcus, "tell me about this morning. Officer Henley mentioned you were carrying something valuable." Marcus's hand moved instinctively to his empty jacket pocket. "It's gone. I gave it away to help a family in need." "What did you give away, Marcus?" The answer would destroy Cassidy completely. "What would you do if you realized you'd humiliated your own hero?" "My Medal of Honor," Marcus said quietly. "I gave it to a mother whose husband is in the hospital. She needed money for her children's Christmas presents." The room went dead silent. Officer Henley looked up from her phone, her face pale. "MS. Reynolds, didn't you mention earlier that your brother was in the hospital last year?" "The children's wing." Cassidy nodded slowly, not understanding where this was leading, but sensing impending doom. "The Marcus Johnson Children's Wing," Officer Henley continued, reading from her screen. "Funded by an anonymous donor who contributed $15 million. The wing that saved your brother's life when he had that rare heart condition." "That's impossible," Cassidy whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Elijah pulled out his phone with the efficiency of someone accustomed to getting answers quickly. "Patricia, it's Elijah. I need you to pull the donor records for the children's wing." "Yes, I'll hold." He looked directly at Cassidy while waiting. "What was your brother's name?" "Tommy," she whispered, her world beginning to crumble. "Tommy Reynolds. He was 8 years old. The doctor said he needed experimental surgery that insurance wouldn't cover." "Tommy Reynolds," Elijah repeated into the phone. "Room 314, last December." "Yes, I see it. Thank you." He hung up and delivered the blow that would haunt Cassidy for the rest of her life. Dr. Marcus Johnson not only donated the $15 million that built the children's wing where your brother was treated, he also performed Tommy's surgery. Pro bono. Cassidy gripped the edge of the desk to keep from collapsing. "No, that's not possible." The surgeon's name was Dr. Peterson. "I remember because..." "Dr. Peterson was the attending physician," Marcus said gently. "But the experimental technique your brother needed? I developed it during my service in Afghanistan, treating soldiers with similar cardiac trauma from explosive devices. I flew in from Seattle specifically to perform that surgery." The memory came flooding back to Cassidy with devastating clarity. She remembered that night in the hospital, remembered a doctor with kind, tired eyes telling her that Tommy would be fine, that he'd done everything possible to save him. She'd been so focused on Dr. Peterson, the famous cardiac surgeon, that she'd barely registered the military doctor who'd actually saved her brother's life. "You saved Tommy," she breathed. "And 3 hours ago, you had me arrested for being homeless," Marcus replied, but there was no anger in his voice. Only exhaustion. But the revelations weren't over. "There's more," Elijah said, his voice heavy with barely contained rage. "Marcus, tell them about the Medal of Honor. Tell them why you have it." Marcus looked away, uncomfortable with the attention. "It's not important." "It's extremely important," Elijah insisted. "Tell them about Kandahar." Officer Henley was already pulling up military records on her phone. Her eyes widened as she read. The Medal of Honor was awarded to Dr. Marcus Johnson for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, she read aloud. During an enemy ambush in Kandahar province, Dr. Johnson single-handedly carried 6 wounded soldiers to safety under heavy fire, then performed field surgery on all of them with limited medical supplies. His actions saved 6 lives that day. The security office had filled with mall employees and curious onlookers, all listening in stunned silence. "This man," Elijah said, his voice carrying to everyone present, "is a certified American hero. He has saved hundreds of lives as a Navy SEAL medic, as a civilian surgeon, and as a human being who puts others before himself." He turned back to Cassidy, who was now openly weeping. Today, he was humiliated and arrested for the crime of being homeless. But worse than that, he was forced to give away his Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration our country can bestow, to help a stranger's family buy Christmas presents. The crowd murmured in disbelief and growing anger. "And you," Elijah said to Cassidy, called him a fraud. Within minutes, the story exploded across every platform. The original video of Cassidy's confrontation was now paired with the devastating revelation of Marcus's true identity. #HeroHomeless began trending worldwide, and donations poured in from across the country to help veterans experiencing homelessness. David Goldman, owner of Goldman's Pawn Shop, arrived at the mall carrying a familiar velvet box. He'd closed his store and driven straight over after seeing the news. "Dr. Johnson," he said, approaching Marcus with reverence, "a young woman came in earlier, tried to sell this. When I realized what it was and heard your story, I refused to buy it. Some things are too precious to be sold, even for the best reasons." He placed the Medal of Honor back in Marcus's trembling hands. "The family you helped, Mrs. Martinez? The community has already raised over $50,000 to cover her husband's medical bills and ensure their children have the Christmas they deserve. You don't need to sacrifice your honor to help others. We can do that together." Marcus stared at the medal, tears streaming down his face for the first time since his ordeal began. Cassidy approached slowly, her orange blazer now wrinkled and stained with tears. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past hour. "Dr. Johnson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know how to apologize for what I did to you. You saved my brother's life, and I treated you like a human being who was struggling." Marcus finished gently. "We all make mistakes, Ms. Reynolds. The question is what we learn from them." "I'm going to resign," she said. "I don't deserve to work here after what I did." "No," Marcus said firmly, surprising everyone. "You made a terrible mistake, but you're young. You can learn from this. Use this experience to see people differently, to treat them with dignity regardless of their circumstances. That kind of growth is worth more than any resignation." Elijah stepped forward. "Marcus, I want to offer you something. The Winters Foundation is opening a new Veterans Rehabilitation Center. We need someone who understands both medicine and the struggles our veterans face. Would you consider directing it?" Marcus looked around the room, at Officer Henley nodding encouragingly, at the crowd of people who now saw him for who he truly was, at Cassidy, who was learning what real redemption looked like. "I'd be honored," he said. 6 months later, the Marcus Johnson Veterans Recovery Center opened its doors. Dr. Marcus Johnson stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, his Medal of Honor pinned proudly to his chest, fully recovered and ready to save lives again. Cassidy Reynolds worked beside him, no longer in her orange blazer, but in simple scrubs, having found her calling helping the veterans she'd once dismissed. What would you have done in Cassidy's place? Do you believe she deserved a second chance? Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who've lost everything, but still choose to help others.